The year is 1346. The walls of Caffa rise like tombstones against the Black Sea, casting long shadows over a harbour that once bustled with the wealth of nations. But now, silence. The kind of silence that precedes horror. Inside those walls, Genoese merchants clutch their prayer beads with trembling fingers. Outside, the Golden Horde has encircled the city like a noose, but they carry something far deadlier than siege engines. They carry death itself. What happened next would change the course of human history forever. Because at Caffa, warfare crossed a line that humanity had never dared cross before. Caffa wasn't just another trading post. This was the crown jewel of Genoese commerce in the east, a fortress city perched on the Crimean Peninsula, where European merchants grew fat on silk, spices and silver flowing from the Mongol Empire. For over a century, it had been a bridge between worlds, where Christian crosses stood alongside Muslim crescents in the name of profit. But by 1346, that delicate balance was crumbling. The Mongol Khans who had once welcomed foreign traders were dying, literally dying, from a plague that had swept across Asia like wildfire. They called it the Great Mortality. We know it by another name, the Black Death. The disease had already carved a path of devastation across Central Asia, leaving entire cities as monuments to the dead. And now, it followed the trade routes west, carried in the fleas of rats, in the breath of the dying, in the very air itself. Leading the siege was Jani Beg, Khan of the Golden Horde, a man whose empire stretched from the Danube to the Urals, but whose time was running out. The plague had already begun its grim harvest among his people, turning his vast armies into walking corpses. Inside Caffa's walls huddled the Genoese defenders, led by merchants turned soldiers who had never imagined their counting houses would become battlefields. They had provisions, they had walls 40 feet high, and they had the sea at their backs. What they didn't have was any comprehension of what was about to be unleashed upon them. The Mongol siege began in early 1346 with traditional methods. Catapults hurled stones, arrows darkened the sky, and siege towers crept toward the walls like wooden predators. For months the defenders held their ground. The Genoese were no strangers to warfare. Their merchant empire had been built as much by the sword as by the ledger. But then the real enemy arrived. The plague struck the Mongol camp with the fury of divine wrath. Soldiers who had charged the walls at dawn were writhing in agony by dusk, their bodies erupting in black buboes the size of apples. The stench of death began to overpower even the smell of gunpowder and burning pitch. Chroniclers describe scenes that sound like something from Dante's Inferno. Warriors would wake to find their tent mates dead beside them, blood streaming from their eyes and mouths. Entire regiments simply vanished, their ranks thinning like morning mist until only scattered survivors remained to tell the tale. And then, in a moment that would echo through the centuries, Jani Beg made a decision that changed the nature of warfare forever. If the plague was killing his army, why not make it kill his enemies too? Picture this: massive trebuchets, normally used to hurl boulders, now loaded with something far more sinister. The bloated, blackened corpses of plague victims, men who had been living, breathing warriors just days before, were placed in the cups of these engines of war like grotesque ammunition. The physics of horror: each catapult could launch a human body nearly 300 yards. As these makeshift missiles arced through the air and crashed into Caffa's streets and courtyards, they brought with them not just the psychological terror of desecration, but something infinitely worse: contamination. The defenders tried everything. They hauled the corpses to the harbour and dumped them into the sea as quickly as they could. They burned them in great pyres that sent black smoke billowing across the city. They scrubbed the stones with vinegar and prayers, but it was already too late. The plague had found new hosts. Within weeks, the same symptoms that had devastated the Mongol camp began appearing inside Caffa's walls. The buboes, the fever, the bleeding, death stalking through the streets like an invisible army more effective than any human force. The irony was bitter as wormwood. Jani Beg's biological warfare worked too well. The plague spread so rapidly through both armies that the siege effectively ended not in victory or defeat, but in mutual annihilation. The Mongols, their ranks decimated, were forced to withdraw. But the Genoese had won a Pyrrhic victory. They held a city increasingly populated by the dead. But the true horror of Caffa wasn't what happened during the siege. It was what happened after. When Genoese ships finally escaped the plague-ridden city, they carried more than refugees and cargo. They carried fleas, rats, and the plague itself. These merchant vessels, fleeing westward across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean, became floating plague ships, maritime harbingers of the apocalypse. When they docked at Constantinople, Messina, Genoa, and Venice, they unloaded not just goods, but the Black Death itself onto European soil. From these ports, the plague spread like spilled ink across a map. It would kill between 75 and 200 million people, roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's population. Entire bloodlines were extinguished. Villages became ghost towns. The very structure of medieval society crumbled under the weight of mass death. What Jani Beg had done at Caffa was more than just a desperate military tactic. He had crossed a threshold that humanity had never crossed before, the deliberate weaponization of disease. He had proven that biological warfare wasn't just possible, it was devastatingly effective. The concept would lie dormant for centuries, but it never truly died. During World War II, both Japanese and Nazi scientists would study plague warfare, inspired partly by historical accounts of Caffa. The spectre of biological weapons would haunt the Cold War, leading to international treaties that tried to ban what medieval Mongols had unleashed in a moment of desperate innovation. What drove Jani Beg to such extremes? Perhaps it was the sheer hopelessness of watching his empire crumble from within, one plague victim at a time. Perhaps it was the cruel logic of a mind that had seen too much death to be shocked by the idea of using corpses as weapons. Or perhaps it was something darker, the recognition that in the face of an enemy like the plague, traditional concepts of honor and warfare became meaningless luxuries. When death itself becomes your ally, moral boundaries begin to seem like arbitrary lines drawn in the sand. The Siege of Caffa stands as a grim milestone in human history, the moment when warfare evolved from killing the living to weaponizing the dead. It reminds us that in our darkest hours, human ingenuity doesn't always serve noble purposes. Sometimes it serves horror. The plague that began its European rampage at Caffa would reshape the continent in ways that are still felt today. It would end the medieval world, trigger religious upheavals, transform labor relations, and alter the very DNA of European civilization. And it all began with a desperate Khan's decision to load his catapults not with stones, but with corpses. Thousands died screaming within Caffa's walls. Millions more would follow across Europe. The biological warfare that began as a last-ditch siege tactic became the catalyst for one of history's greatest catastrophes. In the end, Jani Beg won his siege, but he also doomed half a continent. Sometimes victory and defeat are separated by nothing more than the flight path of a plague-infected flea. The Black Death had found its gateway to Europe, and it all began with the first biological weapon in recorded history, hurled from the trebuchets of a dying empire into the heart of medieval civilization.